So I wanted to start out with a question today. Have you ever had a time in your life where you felt totally alone? I mean, there were people around, but you felt alone because there was something going on in your life, something that was weighing on you that you didn't feel like anyone else would understand. Or maybe they might understand, but you weren't really comfortable telling anybody else because, my goodness, what would they think of me if they knew this was going on in my life? And thing that's kind of funny is that it's in those moments that we most need people around us. But those events in our lives that drive us towards needing people also tend to lead to barriers that make it difficult for us to tell anyone else, because who can you trust? If I tell them, what are they going to think of me? Or who are they going to tell? Or what's going to happen? And what ends up happening then is that the difficulty of life begins to isolate us. And as we get more isolated, we feel more alone. As we feel more alone, we pull further away, and we feel yet more alone. I've certainly had times like that in my life, more than once, and I'm going to bet you have too. So what we need in times like that is to actually have people we can trust, or people that we can depend on, people that we can actually go to because we have a meaningful relationship with them, that we've got a relationship in place that we can lean on. But those relationships, although incredibly important, are incredibly rare. Rarely do we have relationships like that in place. And one of the challenges of having a relationship like that is that they take a long time to create. And it takes a lot of work to create them. And the problem is that on the day you need that relationship, you can't start creating it on that day. It's too late. So you've got to have been working on that in advance. And I would say for years in advance. So the day that it comes, that those events in your life come, the relationship is already there. Now, of course, as I mention relationships, I think a natural idea, a natural thing that comes to mind is that I've got lots of relationships. I've got great friends. I've got family. Man, I'm around people all the time. And those, of course, are really good things, so that we should have good relationships, good friends, people around. But we need something more than that. We need more than just friends. We need more than just family. I believe that we all need a small core group of people that we have a unique relationship with. And it's interesting is that what I have found in my life is that relationship that is so powerfully important in those moments is outside of kind of my regular friendships. That it seems to be a relationship that's kind of purpose-built to do these things. Now, as you may recall, we're in a series called Follower. Right? And in this series, what we're looking at is what Jesus repeatedly told us to do. Follow me. Do what you see me do. Listen to my teaching and take action based on that. And as we talked about last week, one of the reasons that he says that is that he says that I will give you the tools to live a better life. I will give you the tools to be able to deal with the difficulties of life. That I will give you the tools that when the storms of life eventually come, and they will come, that you will have a solid footing to stand on. So follow me. And what I want to look at today is something that Jesus addresses, but it's not as obvious as maybe it could be. It's something that's easy to miss. Because one of the things that Jesus shows us is that connections matter. That the connections we have with people in our life matter. And we all need to have a core group of people that we have a strong, personal, deep relationship with. Because we all need relationship. That we need relationships with people that we care about and people who strengthen us. And when we are down, they lift us up. And we need to be in a relationship where not only do they do that for us, but we're willing to do that for them as well. We need a group of people that we can lean on like no one else, that allows us to fall apart when we need to, and know that they'll be there. They may not even try to fix us because maybe they can't fix us, and they're okay with that too, to just be there with us. But now, this idea of looking at Jesus and looking at Jesus for a model for creating personal relationships, that may seem kind of strange because you look at Jesus and man, didn't he love everybody? Well, he did love everybody, and certainly loving everybody, and he had a relationship with everybody. That's a fairly tough standard to live up to. Right? We're called to love everybody, but it's not easy to do. And if I love everybody, I can't have a deep relationship with everybody. That's not really possible. But it turns out that Jesus didn't approach it that way. Yes, he does love everybody, and he had relationships with everybody. But his relationship with everyone was not the same. That if we look closely at the life of Jesus, he had relationships at many different levels. And he interacted with those different relationships in different ways. Now again, he's loving to everyone. But if we look at the documents that show us his life, those things we call the Gospels, right? Those accounts of what he lived like. Yes, he loved everyone, but he did not invite everyone into his life. Not everyone had an inside track on life with Jesus, that personal side of Jesus' life. He had people that he was close to, and then there were people he really shared his life with. And I believe that if we look at the layers that Jesus used in his own relationships, it shows us the kind of layers we need in our relationships. Because we all have relationships in our lives, but if you look around at the people you know, you don't look at everyone the same. Right? There are some people who relationships are more casual with. There are some people we kind of interact with more regularly. And then there are some people who we're still closer to. But even those that you are closest to, how many of those relationships are completely unfiltered, safe places to fall apart and deal with what's going on in a real way? Now, if we look at Jesus and the relationships that he had, we can see very quickly that there are these clear different layers. I mean, we do know that there were times where there were literally thousands of people following Jesus. But now those thousands of people were not close personal friends. Right? There are people he did have a relationship with, and he certainly cared about them. But we also know that as we read along, some of those people came, some of those people went. When things got stressful, a lot of them just kind of walked away. So those ones weren't really close, right? But then there were those that he was closer to, that he knew pretty well. We talked about one of those groups last week. There's the group that we often forget, the 72 disciples. There was this group of 72 people that he had invited a bit more in, that he had a closer relationship with, that he taught them more deeply. He trusted them to go out and do things without his active supervision. So he was certainly closer to those 72 than to those thousands that were there. But those weren't really part of his core group. Again, closer to them, but not really a core group. And then he had friends that he had kind of recurring solid relationship with. Probably the most well-known are the sisters Mary and Martha and their brother Lazarus. Mary and Martha were the ones who fought one day over whether to cook dinner for Jesus or listen to Jesus, sort of thing. And we know that whenever Jesus would pass by where they lived, he would stop and he would stay with them. And, they'd enjoy a meal together. He might teach. They'd spend time together. So they were certainly good friends, but their relationship wasn't constant. As he came through, he would spend some time with them. And I'm sure it was close, and I'm sure that they were among his closer friends. But the people he probably knew the best were likely Mary Magdalene, because she traveled with him a good deal of the time, and of course the 12 apostles. Right? The 12 apostles were the ones that he's walking and traveling with all the time. And so he would have known them incredibly well because he was actively sharing life with them. But now we often think of that group of 12 being his closest friends. But it turns out the entire group of 12 was not his closest friends. That within that 12, there were 3 people that he had an especially close relationship with. And I believe these 3 people give us the model for that kind of core group that we each need to find a way to have. This was Peter, John, and John's brother James. That, as we'll see in just a moment, Jesus shared aspects of his life with those 3 men that he shared with no one else. And he actually makes it really clear in his interactions with them. Because as we'll see that he actually invites them to see aspects of himself that he shows no one else. He invites them to know things about what he's doing that he has not told anyone else. And when he's hurting, he asks them to support him like no one else. Now, the first thing we'll look at comes to us from the gospel writer Mark. Now, Mark's kind of an interesting gospel writer because Mark, the document that Mark wrote, that we call the Gospel of Mark, Mark never knew Jesus. Mark was a follower of Peter's. And we believe Peter was probably illiterate. He was a fisherman. He wouldn't have been trained how to read and write. So what Mark wrote down for us is what he learned from Peter. And where that's really valuable is because Peter had this inside track. Peter was closest to Jesus. So Peter could relate things that others may not have seen. So Mark tells us that Jesus took Peter, James, and John and led them up a high mountain to be alone. So he's with his core group. He's with his 12 initially, that kind of close group. But then he says, I need to be with just my core group. That he actually takes time to say, it's not that you're not important to me, but what we're doing here is something I need to be able to step away with my core group and spend time with them. He wanted to be alone with them because he's about to show them an aspect of himself that he's never shown anyone else. Because as Mark continues, as the men watched, Jesus' appearance was transformed, and his clothes became dazzling white, far whiter than any earthly bleach could ever make them. So this is an event often referred to as the transfiguration, where Jesus is actually allowing a truer version of himself to be seen, that glory, that light that's inside of him to shine through. And he's allowing them to see that. He's revealing himself more completely to them than he's ever revealed himself to anyone else. And as he allows them to see more of himself, he then reveals to him more about what he's here to do. Because then Mark describes for us something miraculous that happens. It says, then Elijah and Moses appeared and began talking with Jesus. Now, obviously, this would be a miraculous event. These men have been dead for centuries at this point. But these 2 men represent something critically important. Moses was the author of the law, right? It was given to him by God. He recorded it in those early books of the Old Testament. And Elijah was one of the most prominent prophets, the ones who spoke for God for centuries. So they both represent the law and the prophets. Now, what we call the Old Testament, Jewish people call the law and the prophets. So this was where God's people for centuries had looked for what God wanted them to do. The way they had found God's leading was through the law and the prophets. So those 2 men represented the voice and presence of God's leading. Now, as Peter, James, and John see Jesus talking with Moses and Elijah, Mark tells us something else happens. It says, then a cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, this is my dearly loved son. Listen to him. Jesus is revealing to Peter, James, and John what he is here to do. That Jesus is here to provide the new voice for God, that new leading of what God wants us to do. That Jesus had come to change things. That yes, the way you used to find that was in the law and the prophets. But a more perfected version of that is coming, and Jesus is the one who brings that. Now, Jesus has talked in general about these issues throughout his ministry, but he has never so clearly revealed this to anyone else before this time. So he's letting them in closer to what he's doing than he's let anyone else in. And then he makes clear that what you just saw is just for you right now. That this is something I'm sharing with you because of the relationship that we have. Because after all this happens, Mark tells us that as they went down the mountain, Jesus told them not to tell anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. In other words, Jesus is saying that I trust you, and for now, this is just for you. But when the time comes, I also trust you. I trust that you will know the right time to start sharing this with other people. That he trusted them to do what he would not be there to do later. And so he invited them into this experience because he trusted them to keep it to themselves for now, but at the right time, take action based on what they'd seen. Now, as we look at this event, we might be tempted to say that, well, I don't really see this as a relationship. It's kind of just teaching. Because, he already did kind of different levels of teaching, right? He taught the 72 at one level. He taught the 12 at another level. Maybe he's just teaching these three at another level. And there's certainly an aspect of that. But what we also see is trust being exercised. That invitation to see the truer version of who I am, to see my glory before anyone else ever sees it. So he's inviting them into that. But even beyond that, we see another event that Jesus shares with them that really shows the depths of Jesus' relationship with Peter, James, and John. And this comes in those final hours before Jesus is executed. Now remember that Jesus is executed on a Friday. Before that previous evening on Thursday night, he had dinner with his apostles. Right, what we call the Last Supper, what we celebrate today with communion. And Jesus, that night before, sat down, shared some more lessons with them. They shared a meal, they shared wine, and then after that, they actually go out and take a short trip. And what happens is that then Jesus went with his apostles to the olive grove called Gethsemane. And he said, sit here while I go over there to pray. So now it sounds like, when you first read that, it sounds like, okay, well, they've all been at dinner. They've done the dinner thing. They go out for a walk. And it seems like Jesus is saying, hey, you guys, you 12, or 11 at this point, you 11, sit over there. I'm going to go over here to pray. But then he says something else. From there he says, he took Peter, Zebedee's two sons, James and John, and he became anguished and distressed. He told them, my soul is crushed with grief to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me. So he started out with the full set of apostles. He sat some of them down saying, I'll be back in a minute, but you three, I need you three to come with me. And then with Jesus, Peter, James, and John, they go a little farther. He then has them sit down. And then he goes off just a short distance further to pray. And what we see is that Jesus is in great emotional pain here. He's asked them to come along with him in one of his most human moments of life, where the weight of what he is facing is so heavy and weighing him down. He doesn't want to be alone. So he's asked them to come along for emotional support, to be present with him. He would go on to ask them to pray. And as Jesus prays, He pours out his heart to God, and he's asked his closest friends to be here with him and support him. But it had been a long night. It was late. They'd had a big meal, a little bit of wine, and everybody's getting tired. So after this, Jesus goes back to them. Says, then Jesus returned to the disciples and found them asleep. So he's returned back to Peter, James, and John. And he said to Peter, couldn't you watch with me for even 1 hour? He's like, I just needed your support for this moment. I needed to not be alone in this moment. Couldn't you just be here with me? And his friends let him down. Now, as we know, ultimately Jesus is arrested, and he would ultimately go to the cross. But in this moment, as he sees them asleep, I think we know that Jesus understood human behavior. He knew that these three men would eventually let him down. But he invited them in anyway. In fact, all of his friends let him down. Right? When he was arrested, all of the apostles left him, including these three. So why, knowing that, why would have he invited them in? Well, he had shared a whole bunch of life with them. And he knew he was facing an incredibly difficult moment. And in that moment, he wanted his friends there with him, his closest friends there with him. Knowing that even if they didn't get it exactly right, they were there. Because friendships and relationships don't have to be perfect to be good, to be helpful. And so I think Jesus shows us here that as we invite people in, don't expect them to be perfect. They're going to get things wrong sometimes. That doesn't mean it's bad. It doesn't mean you walk away. People get things wrong sometimes. And relationship with that core group that he could share more with than he shared with anyone else was so important that developing it and maintaining it was still a very good thing and very worth it, even if they got it wrong sometimes. Now, I think that we would all agree that Jesus was a pretty amazing person, kind of lived a life well beyond our reach. I mean, even if you're not a Christian, no one seriously doubts that Jesus existed. Jesus was a real person, even if you don't believe. He came from God. And no one really doubts that he lived a life beyond what other people could live. So, given that he lived amazingly well, that he was incredibly well grounded, and if you are a Christian, you believe that he was deeply connected to God, he had all that. Yet he felt that a critical part of living life well, of living a healthy, well-balanced life, because that's what Jesus models for us, what a healthy, well-balanced, well-executed life looks like. To have that kind of life, it's critically important that you have that core group of people in your life that you can really lean on. And I think as Jesus developed this group, he didn't develop it just for himself, because he knew that Peter, James, and John would need that kind of core as well. That following his death and resurrection, they were going to take on incredible burdens. They were going to lead the church. They were going to deal with all kinds of opposition. They would be left to face incredible challenges, and it would not have been good for them to try to face those challenges alone. But your life has incredible challenges. My life has challenges. And it's not good for any of us to face those challenges alone. We are not built to do that alone. And friendships are good, and casual friendships are good, and kind of regular friendships are good. But we all need a core group that we can lean on. Now, I don't think most of us have them. But if you develop them, it will make all the difference in your life. So, to ask the obvious question, do you have a core group of friends like that in your life? Friends that you would want with you to see you in the most difficult moments of your life. People you could actually freely share your faults, your failings, all those things you get wrong. And you could do it without feeling judged. And here's the other side. And they could share theirs with you and you wouldn't judge them. Do you have that core group in your life? Because I think those relationships are incredibly rare, but incredibly important. So I think we have a way to determine if we have that in our lives. As I was kind of reading through all this and I was praying about it and thinking about it, I realized that the way we can make that determination is actually given to us by Jesus' brother, whose name is also James. Because Jesus' brother James actually writes something for us. He would write it a few years later that I think we can really measure if we have this kind of relationship. It says, confess your sins to each other and pray for each other so that you may be healed. In other words, it's good for us to be able to open up to someone. Right? So do you have a group of people where you can say, you know what, I have totally blown it. I've done things that I don't really want anyone to know, but I know it's better for me and my relationships to be able to talk to someone about this. Do you have someone that you can actually tell them when you get it wrong, when you've hurt someone? That you can tell them things that have happened in your life that you would be afraid that other people would find out, but know that you're safe with them. And not filter yourself at all. Not hold back any of the truth. And know that you could do all that. And the reaction would not be to judge you, but their natural reaction would be to lovingly pray for you. If we don't have that in our lives, Jesus' brother tells us that we're not going to have emotional health. We're not going to find emotional healing. That our well-being will be impacted if we do not have that as an aspect of our lives. So that's what's at stake. That's what's at stake if we don't make an effort to put together this core group of people that you can really lean into. People that we can share life with the way Jesus' brother James describes. So how do we do it? How do we bring that sort of thing into our lives? Because we need to, doesn't matter how old you are, how young you are, it is so important to make the effort to develop this deeper level of relationships with somebody. But here's the thing. I don't think it ever happens by accident. That unless you set out with the explicit goal of developing a core group of a small number of people to have this relationship with, it's not going to happen. And even if you set out to do it intentionally, it's going to take time because it happens progressively. And I know that's because that's how it happened for me. Right? For about 6 years now, almost exactly 6 years now, I've been part of a group, me and 3 other people. Now, we didn't model after Jesus, Peter, James, and John, because we'd have to argue over which one of us is Jesus, which clearly would be me. Right? But it worked out that it was 4 of us. We kind of felt that was a good size. And the thing is that we prioritize this in our lives. 7 a.m. every Thursday morning, we get together. Now, keep in mind, one lives in Oklahoma, one lives in Florida, one lives in Pennsylvania, and one lives in New Hampshire. But we all met in Florida. And we met in person at first, and then as life started to move us around, we live in a time to stay connected. And it was so important to us that we stayed connected. And as we get together, we do a number of things. That basically, we start out each meeting just catching up on each other's week, what's going on in your life. But then we also take time to dig into a study of some sort. And the study sometimes is something that we're all interested in, and we'll dig into that. Sometimes we do a study, which kind of what we're doing right now, is one that we dig into that challenges us. That kind of challenges and then one book we're reading now actually challenges your relationship between being a Christian and politics. And we don't all have the same political views. It is a challenging study, but that's a good thing. But what we also do at the end of each meeting is pray for each other. And we are fairly rigid because it's important to do all these things. Because if all you do is get together to share life with each other, the relationship eventually becomes casual. It's kind of just catching up. And not that that's bad, but that's not what this group is about. Because if it stays casual, it never goes deep. And if we just did a study, well, we'd get all kinds of knowledge, but we never get to know each other. So we get to know each other, we get challenged in the study, and then we pray for each other because prayer connects us. That we share what is happening in our lives that is difficult. And when I pray for someone week after week for years about the challenges in their life, I start to feel those challenges with them. And as we bring our joys and our praises in, and we pray about those week after week, we share in those joys and those praises. And it changes the whole thing. You know, we just had one of our guys who in his 60s just lost his job. And it's the kind of job that when you lose it, you got to move somewhere else in the country to find another one. You know, and I've never had to do that, thank God. But to be in that with someone because you've known them for years, you connect on that. And you can talk about how you really feel about it. And if you want to say it's not fair, that's okay to say here. Those things matter. The ability to voice what you're feeling, even if it's not the right feeling, it's important to be able to voice that and know you're not going to be judged about it. So I would encourage everyone here to make an effort to create that kind of group if you don't already have it. As I said, it's not going to happen by accident. You know, and there are some organizations like AA that are really good at doing this sort of thing. There are other aspects of life where it seems to be really hard to pull these sort of things together. And what I would say to you that as you try to build your group, it's probably not the people you think it will be. It is unlikely that your closest friends are the right choice. Because there's something that happens. If you're already involved with people, particularly people you've been friends with for years, that crisscross into different parts of your life, into your family, into your work, whatever it is, you've got a dynamic built there already. And you can't really suddenly change that into a different kind of dynamic. And also, if they're intertwined in other parts of your life, you may start to worry that they might leak it to other parts of your life. I'm not saying they will, but if that's in your mind, you're not going to be able to open up. So that right group of people is probably not the people who are your closest friends right now. Because this relationship has a purpose. It's purpose-built. It's purpose-built for what we've described. And so it needs to be built from that. And I tried a number of times to develop a group like this that didn't work. And I'm going to say that as encouragement. As you try to do this, as you try to find 2, 3, 4 people that you want to be really close with, if the first, second, third group of people you connect with doesn't work, that's okay. Because I really believe God leads us to the right group of people. But if we don't try, we're not going to find them. Because I initially started out with a closer group of friends, and it didn't work. There wasn't anything wrong with it. It just wasn't what we were trying to do, and fortunately we recognized that. And the group of guys that I'm with now, we only had kind of a casual relationship. We happened to go to the same church. We had got to know each other in a much larger men's group. But the only thing we really aligned on is that we knew each other enough to know that we had a fundamental set of common values, but not much else. And it turns out really not much else. There's a ton of things we don't have in common, and I think that's good too. But because there was no pre-existing dynamic between us, the dynamic developed specifically for what we were trying to achieve. And it seems like you should be able to be casual about developing it, but I don't think that works. I think you have to be intentional. Now, I'd also say that as you try to pull together your core group of people, I don't believe, please don't be offended, I don't believe it should include your spouse or your significant other. Because again, you've got an existing dynamic there that's already wired up. And so it's going to be hard to open up. And let's also be real. Some of the biggest challenges we have in our lives involve our spouse or significant other. Right? If you can't talk about that, well, you're not going to get healthy. Right? But also, even if the issue you're concerned about doesn't directly involve your spouse, you may have things in your life that you're trying to process so you can talk to your spouse about them. This has to be an environment where there are no wrong answers, there are no wrong feelings, there are no hurt feelings. It's like baseball. There's no crying in baseball. Come on, that's a movie reference, guys. Come on. Come on. I'm trying to lighten it up here a little bit. I know it's not a light sermon, so I'm trying. But the reality is that, sometimes there is crying. Right? There is crying, and there is anger. My natural response to stress is anger. Not saying it's a healthy one. I'm working on it. But that is my natural response. But you know what? We can have blow-ups. And we pray for each other at the end. And we all carry on. That's the kind of environment it needs to be. And I would say in general, family members are generally not a good idea. Again, because of the pre-existing dynamic, they tie into other parts of your life. Now, we do see that the brothers James and John pulled it off. So it did work for them. But I think that's the exception. Because remember that Jesus had two sets of brothers in that 12. We had James and John, but we also had Peter and Andrew. So Andrew wasn't in the mix. Right? So I'm not saying never ever family members, but be very careful about that. And then as I finish up, the last thing I would say is give the process time. I would say that it took the crew I'm in 2 years to trust each other, to really trust each other. There had to be some fundamental stuff early on, but before we could talk about things without applying a filter, it took about 2 years. Because deep trust doesn't come easily, and it shouldn't. It shouldn't. People need to earn the right to see all of your life. If the timings of Jesus' life are accurate, 3 years, these two events we just looked at were 3 years in the making. It takes time. And then remember what Jesus knew. As important as these people are, they're not always going to get it right. They're going to make mistakes. Sometimes they will let you down. And you know what? And sometimes you'll let them down too. And that's okay, because you know what do we do at the end? We pray together. And we come back next week, and we do it again. And I truly believe it has transformed my life. I believe it will transform your life. And as we each individually get healthier and more effective in life, we are able to support the people in our lives more effectively. If you do this, you will be a better husband, you will be a better wife, you'll be a better parent, you'll be a better friend, you'll be a better citizen. These things change who we are, and as we embrace the gifts that we are given in this life, and we start to see the gifts we have in this life, we become better at everything we do.